How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
Amy Westervelt is an award-winning print and audio journalist. She's contributed to the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, NPR, and many other news outlets. As head of the independent podcast network Critical Frequency, she has executive produced more than 24 podcasts, including her own show Drill, a true crime show about climate change. We talk about big oil's often covert methods of shaping public opinion and legal rulings in its favor. Today on Climate One. So many things to talk about. You've been covering oil and gas for 20 years. I want to start by going all the way back to your first episode of Drilled. You discussed the remarkable energy research that oil companies funded decades ago. And so what was the Bell Labs of energy, and what happened to it?
This was an initiative that Exxon started in the 70s. It was their Exxon Research and Engineering facility. And I spoke with several former Exxon scientists who all described it the same way, which was that Exxon wanted it to be the Bell Labs of energy. And
for people who don't remember the Bell Labs, right. Say how big a deal Bell Labs
Bell
is.
Labs invented the cell phone, amongst many other
transistors,
comms technologies. Yeah, satellites, cell phones, transistors. So they wanted to do that for energy. And this is, just to sort of set the historical context, this is happening in the 70s. You've had the oil embargo against the U.S. Jimmy Carter is pushing for investments in different types of energy, and the oil companies want to be part of this.
Right, so they want to be not just oil companies, but energy companies, get into solar and all sorts of different things. And then there's some leadership changes, and they basically pivot away from that idea.
There's leadership changes and also market changes. You go from oil skyrocketing, the price per barrel of oil, to it dropping, and there being sort of a glut in the 80s. And also you have Lee Raymond taking over at Exxon, who was very much like, we're an oil company, we've always been an oil company, that's what we do, this other stuff is nonsense. And I do just want to give proper credit to the journalists at Inside Climate News and Columbia Journalism School, the LA Times, for really breaking that story open. In 2015, they published all kinds of internal documents from Exxon. That's what allowed me to figure out who was still alive from those documents and go talk to them.
I think they got a Pulitzer Prize for that.
They did, yeah, well deserved.
And as you cover in detail in your podcast, oil companies began to pivot away. Around the time of this pivot, they also launched PR campaigns, convincing the public that oil and gas was essential to our way of life. Let's hear from Brown University's Dr. Bob Brule on this.
Literally, since after World War II, the fossil fuel companies have actively engaged in public relations campaigns to sell the automobile and fossil fuels as the American way of life and as the good life. And the idea is that fossil fuels become part and parcel of progress, the good life, economic gain, and jobs. And I have a unpublished report from Mobile that talks about how they seeded the collective unconsciousness with these ideas.
So I don't often think of oil companies talking about collective unconscious.
Oh yeah, they, the fossil fuel industry was one of the first clients of the PR industry way back, many, many decades before climate change was a thing, before World War II. They were one of the earliest users of market research. They pilot tested, Elmo Roper's surveys in the 19-teens, I want to say, and early 20s, to really figure out in a very granular way the way that people thought, how people were making decisions on both, what they were buying, but also what they were voting for, and what they could do to sort of shape people's ideas about not just, what brand of gas they were filling up with, but, how they thought about the environment and energy, and how they thought about the economy and what was important, and how they thought about American identity, all of that stuff. And then it really ramped up post-World War II. I actually found a document from an early publicist of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil, this very detailed strategy where he was pulling together all of his clients. So this at the time was like GM, Ford, Campbell's Soup, Procter & Gamble, Eli Lilly, Standard Oil of New Jersey, all of these big American companies, and saying like, all hands on deck. We need to remind Americans that free market capitalism is the thing that makes them American, and like all of your industries are really going to suffer if we allow people to continue to think that the government should be involved in regulating business as much as they have been during the war. Those are the kinds of things the industry has been doing for, more than 100 years before we even get to the climate change issue. They're laying that kind of foundation.
Right. Kind of, Naomi Oreskes has done a lot of work here about sort of market fundamentalism in her new book, kind of the big myth, kind of like it's really this free market ideology that is applied to all these areas. And you talk about these PR people as the madmen of big oil, as you call them, originated in so many tactics against climate action that we're familiar with today. Denial, delay, a lot of the D words, as well as false equivalency, astroturfing, and more. A notable member of this group was a man named Herb Schmertz, Mobil Oil's longtime PR person. And as I listen to your work, I keep coming back to Herb Schmertz.
As do I. I'm obsessed with him. Yeah.
Let's hear a bit of Herb Schmertz and then talk about his impact.
Well, it seems to me that the term spin doctor is something the press has manufactured to really deal with the problem the press has. The press, by and large, would like to control the agenda and the terms of reference of all debates, and they'd like to decide what information they're going to deliver and what information they're not going to deliver.
So how powerful was Schmertz's campaign against mainstream news organizations?
Oh, man. I mean, this is one of the things where I feel like when you talk about PR, a lot of times people think, oh, okay, they're, pitching stories, they're getting their executives interviewed, maybe they're advising on an advertising strategy. No. What these guys mean by it is literally public relations, and that means the relationship that the company and the industry has with various publics. So moms, single women, young people, working men, non-working men, like every demographic, they have a different relationship that they're navigating, including with policymakers, influencers, and press people. And one of the ways to shape all of those relationships is to fundamentally change the structure of how the media works. And Herb Schmertz, I think, more than anyone, really did that. Like he came in and he said, forget this whole thing where you're trying to be friends with the journalists. Like, you need to bully them. You need to call up their boss and threaten to get them fired if they're not covering your company correctly. You need to make them, accuse them of bias, which was really effective. I credit him a lot with the emergence of false equivalence in the 80s and 90s in a big way, because he would accuse any journalist that didn't basically like let Mobil have half of an article, to share their viewpoint, of being biased against the industry, against business people in general. He went on this whole crusade with Hollywood because he was mad that the bad guys in every TV show were always businessmen. So he would go and meet with all these studios and be like, you need to stop vilifying, corporate businessmen. He famously had this big spat with the Wall Street Journal. This is obviously a very different Wall Street Journal than exists today, back in the 80s and 90s. And he was mad about how they were covering the oil and gas industry in general and Mobil in particular. He demanded a meeting. at this meeting, he had like a bullet point list where he was going to walk them through all the ways that they were, missing Mobil's valuable insights into things. And he got as far as the first bullet point, and the executive editor at the time just jumped up and said, "Everything you're saying is bullshit," and left the room. And Herb Schmertz was like, that's it. He canceled all their ad buys with the Wall Street Journal. He refused to let Wall Street Journal journalists have access to like earnings numbers, reports, wouldn't let them talk to anyone at the company. It was like, that's it. We're not going to even speak to you anymore. And at first, the Journal kind of stood their ground, but, you look 5 or so years down the road and Mobil's ads are back in play. Coverage has softened against the industry considerably. There are a lot more oil and gas executives being interviewed in stories about, environmental policy and the impact that it has on the industry and all of those kinds of things. So, his tactic worked. He's also the guy who created the advertorial with the New York Times. So this, again, is something that Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran have covered extensively, but Mobil and then ExxonMobil had weekly opinion pieces in the New York Times op-ed section that were ads, but they looked like editorials and
highly effective.
They were
there for
effective.
like decades, it seems like.
Yeah,
right? They were there for a long time.
Close to 30 years. Yeah. Yeah.
And his work laid the early groundwork for the First Amendment corporate free speech argument that oil companies are using today to defend their actions when it comes to client denial. Tell us about that and its importance.
Yeah. He helped create the advertorial, right, in print. It was very successful for them. He really came up with this whole idea of like, look, instead of selling gas, we should be selling ideas. We need to develop a personality for Mobil and, get people to think of us a particular kind of way. He wanted them to be the thinking man's oil company. And, so, he had the advertorials. He was sponsoring content on PBS. They launched Masterpiece Theater. This is all happening in the late 70s. And then he has the idea of taking the advertorials to TV. So they make all of these video advertorials and they take them out to the big 3 TV stations at the time, which were NBC, ABC, and CBS. And CBS and ABC said, no, these are propaganda and we're not going to run them. We're pretty sure it would be an ethics violation for us and maybe even illegal. No way. And Herb Schmertz and Raleigh Warner, who was the CEO of Mobil at the time, really saw this as a big potential problem for them. They were like, what if the New York Times starts reconsidering this too because of this? What if PBS starts to think, maybe, we're running afoul of ethics here? So they made a big full court press. They went to all of the little like economics clubs in different cities. They went to the US Chamber. They were on radio and TV everywhere, making the argument that it was very important to American democracy to protect corporate free speech. And this is like the first time that you start to see this being made as a legal argument. They also helped to gather support for a big case that predates Citizens United called Bilotti, which was really like the first kind of shoe to drop in the whole corporate free speech arena. And today, ExxonMobil and Chevron and Shell and all these other companies are saying, look, anything we've ever said about climate was in service of shaping policy in a particular way. That makes
public speech, not commercial speech.
That's right. That makes it, they call it petitioning speech or political speech, which means that it's protected.
So it's not about our product.
It's the argument that they're making in, multiple climate liability and fraud cases against them.
Schmertz really is the godfather.
Schmertz.
Yeah. Oil companies had other tools too, like weaponizing uncertainty, which you call scientists kryptonite. I love that phrase. And they attacked and intimidated climate scientists and journalists. In your latest season of Drilled, we hear from Steve Cull, an investigative journalist for The New Yorker magazine, who authored an excellent book called Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power.
Yeah.
He had this to say about the company.
I thought it was hard to report on the CIA, and I came to understand that Exxon was far more difficult and a little bit scarier even. I joked with my colleagues that, if I disappeared, like if some van pulled up beside me on the street and I was bundled away and they never saw me again, that it wouldn't be Al Qaeda, which I had reported on. It wouldn't be the CIA, which I had reported on. It'd probably be Exxon. They have that way of creeping people out of intimidation, actually. And it's a strategy, and they're very practiced at it and effective at it. They have a lot of power and resources with which to intimidate people.
Hearing that just creeps me out.
I know. Yeah, he put it very succinctly and boldly. But yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's done an Exxon story has a story like that.
Well, you have stories. You, in the pod, you mentioned this, that your hotel reservation was canceled.
Yeah.
So what intimidation have you personally experienced because of going after these companies this way?
Yeah. I have to say, for legal reasons, I can neither prove nor disprove that Exxon was directly involved with any of these things. But every time we've done an Exxon story, if there's travel involved, all my travel plans get canceled.
Exxon calls Marriott and says,
someone calls someone, and
and your hotel room disappears.
Or I show up at the airport and my ticket has been canceled, or I go to get my rental car and that reservation's been canceled, or it's just sort of like.
So harassment, kind of.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, okay, this is happening. When I was in Guyana reporting our most recent season, my hotel room got broken into and my laptop was open with like various files on it, but nothing was stolen from my hotel room. So again, I don't know who it was, but someone who was not interested in the cash on my nightstand, or taking my laptop with them. And I don't leave anything that's sensitive on my laptop. So it's not like I was like, oh no, they have information I don't want them to have. It's just sort of like, okay,
But no, I mean, we live in an era where journalists have physical threats and worse.
Absolutely.
So nothing of that nature is happening.
No.
Good.
Yeah. I'm lucky in that regard.
You and I both work in the media. Many people talk about the media as a monolith. We know that it's not.
Yes.
Podcasters, public radio, cable TV, we're all sort of lumped together. And often the oil industry is presented as a monolith by environmentalists and others. Mm-hmm. Large branded oil companies are different than independent operators, refiners. If it's like big oil, it's like it's one big monolith. I'm curious if you think about, whether your work perpetuates that image of a monolith and kind of this, it's all big oil, like, Exxon and Lee Raymond pulling all the strings.
Yeah.
And how do you think that do you perpetuate the notion of big oil as a monolith?
I try not to. I actually think that it's really not just big oil. There's a lot of complicity along the way with, trade groups, PR firms, media, politicians, other industries too. Like for some reason, the automotive industry has kind of gotten a pass on a lot of climate stuff, even though they're right there the whole way with the oil companies.
There might be, some might say there's more space between oil and autos now.
Maybe. They have less incentive today to want to sell more combustion engine cars, right? So it'll be interesting to see actually how that kind of changes the relationship between those two. But, you have other examples are like the National Association of Manufacturers is kind of there all along as well. There are lots of other people who are involved in obstructing climate action. I would say also that we haven't had accountability for any of them. So I would kind of push back on the idea that like it's bad to, talk about big oil or big industry or whatever, because none of them have actually been held accountable for any of this, nor have they changed how they operate in any meaningful way. I think we're still at less than 3% capital expenditures on anything that's not fossil fuel development, for example. They still have an enormous amount of power in not just the US government, but governments all over the world. I mean, Guyana is a really good example where, Exxon is kind of running the show there at this point. So the idea that like, on the one hand, I don't want to overly vilify any one player within a system, because I think, look, oil companies are doing what they are incentivized and enabled to do.
Capitalism is
Exactly.
to shareholder value.
It's
they're
like
doing what they're supposed
they're
to do.
focused on profits, and that's like, and if we want them to be focused on something different, they need to be, forced to do that. On the other hand, I think the idea that like climate denial was a thing that happened in the past that had this past impact and is that like these companies are any different now than they were in the 80s is not really backed by any evidence. Their marketing's different, that's for sure. Their websites have changed, but they're still, like for example, leveraging a war to sell more gas. Like, again, a thing that they are encouraged and enabled to do by the systems that we have in place. But that doesn't necessarily give them a total pass, especially because they've been so integral in shaping those systems. They can't say, well, we're just doing what the government tells us to do when they have so much power over what the government tells everybody to do.
They've written a lot of the rules of the game. And,
right.
We had a board member of ConocoPhillips on a recent episode of Climate One, Arjun Murthy, saying that oil and gas companies will be terrible as energy companies. They're not good at it. So
right.
The idea that, we should make them energy companies, kind of like what they wanted to do potentially when they're the Bell Labs of energy, they were on that path. It didn't work out.
I think if they were going to do that, it would have happened by now. So I don't, I will say in terms of the, the monolith thing, I think it's very dangerous to lump, everyone that works at an oil company together. There are lots of oil workers, engineers, managers, all kinds of folks who have skills that are needed in an energy transition, in lots of other kinds of industries, and who are not calling the shots. Like, I don't think that the entirety of, ExxonMobil, for example, is to blame for how the company is behaving in Guyana. Just to give one example. But there are specific people making specific decisions that have pretty far-reaching consequences. And I think it's disingenuous of them to, be trying to develop as many fossil fuel resources as possible, while at the same time claiming to be actively working on climate.
Right, and there are individuals who've left fossils to go to work in renewables and various biofuels or solar, whatever. I know people who have made that. Well, you've talked to so many people and had so many fascinating interviews. What tape gives you goosebumps, or what makes you giddy, hearing? Like, what's like, ooh?
I like the thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is there was some tape I got in season 1 with Ed Garvey, who was the guy who did all of the research on like the big research tanker that Exxon had in the 70s, where they were trying to understand how how CO2 emissions behave along the equator and how the ocean, does or doesn't absorb CO2 and where it releases CO2 and all of those kinds of things. And he was in charge of doing that research. And at the time he was like this young, fresh out of school, really excited. He's like, oh, Exxon was like the most exciting place for a scientist to work. And then, his job got cut when the whole kind of research program got cut, and he went on to do other things. But I had this conversation with him where he talked about the fact that like he had been watching the company for years since then with kind of horror at what was being done with the research that he and his colleagues had done, and feeling sort of like he should do something about it, but not knowing what he could do about it. And it's like, it was something that had been, had been reported on. He'd been interviewed in lots of different magazine stories and stuff, but you could hear the emotion in his voice in the tape. He was kind of like, there was like a catch in his throat where he really was just like, you can empathize with it, feeling sort of like, I have like knowledge and information that might be helpful here. And also like, I worked with this company, I should be able to do something here, and feeling sort of powerless to do anything. Yeah, that's one that like sticks with me.
So what have you learned in 20 years of covering big oil's crimes, and how have you personally changed?
Well, one thing that really shifted how I think was the crab story. A good number of the crab fishermen told me that the jury's still out on climate, but yet had signed on to a lawsuit about the oil companies' role in delaying action on climate. Talking to so many people who, really boiled it down for me to this issue of fairness. And that is something that I think relates to any kind of big story right now, that the idea that everyone should have the same information, that disinformation and sort of the overwhelming amount of space and volume that corporations have to speak with in this country is quite damaging to democracy and to people's ability to be able to make decisions. So right now, my current obsession is sort of the free speech thing, and just how much, the fossil fuel industry and other industries are working really hard right now to criminalize free speech in this country. There are anti-protest laws. They're called critical infrastructure laws in about 20 states now in the US that massively increase the fines and prison time associated with protest near anything that's considered critical infrastructure, which can be a pipeline, power station, railroad, highway overpass, a bridge. You're near critical infrastructure in most places in any city. So the impact that might have on free speech across the board is concerning. And at the same time, to see these companies making the argument that lying is protected speech for corporations, so sort of expanding corporate free speech and working to curb individual free speech is something that I think is very concerning, and it's been going on for 20 odd years.
Yeah, it really got a boost after Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yes.
A lot of those laws really grew out of that. Amy Westervelt is an award-winning investigative journalist, host of podcast Drilled, Damages, and Hot Take, and executive producer at Critical Frequency Podcast Network. Thank you, Amy, so much for sharing.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.